Math was never my strong suit. I was more of a wing an essay test, BS a term paper kind of guy. But as I sit here trying to extol the breadth of my reverence for the 1911, I find myself thinking of an equation. POA equals POI, and if you're not conversant in high-concept gun math, that means it shoots where the fuck you point it. Or if you're a prude, point of aim equals point of impact. And no other 1911 captures the essence of this simple mathematical truth more than the Springfield Mil-Spec 45. And that's what we're going to talk about today here on Hipster Tactical.
It was a smoking gun. It was a smoking gun. It was a smoking gun. It was a smoking gun.
Alright folks, it's been a long time coming. Finally a 1911 on Hipster Tactical, and this review is going to somewhat focus on the 1911 in general, as the intro kind of suggested, and why I think it's still relevant and still important and still in some ways unsurpassed even in the modern tactical landscape. But it will also focus on the Springfield Mil-Spec specifically as a manifestation of what the 1911 is and why the 1911 is and why I think the Mil-Spec is everything a 1911 should be. And that's kind of my takeaway with the Milspec. It is the most quintessential, most fundamental expression of the 1911's merits as a handgun. It makes shooting to point of aim just very natural, it feels very natural to shoot, and it stacks big fucking holes right where you want them every time you pull the trigger, and it, in my experience, it does so very reliably, and it does so for $500. And what could be more relevant than that? You know, we see so many videos, so many reviews. Is the 1911 still relevant? Is the 1911 still, you know, can it compete with modern designs? I think we overlook the importance and the necessity of shootability in modern handguns. We keep coming back to the 1911, and I don't think it's just because of nostalgia. Again, it's because the guns shoot so damn well. You know, I think there are certain questions on reliability with 1911s in the modern age, and we're certainly going to talk about that. But my experience with this Milspec has been excellent. I'm very impressed with the gun, and I think it's an excellent gun. So I think that kind of gives you my take on the Milspec overall. So if that's all you came here for, that's thank you, come again. But I think the more interesting question is, why does the 1911 still shoot so damn well after 113 years in the business? I think part of the answer to that question lies in just this idea of, again, simple math. We all know that old saying, quite often the simplest solution to a problem is the best solution. The origins of the 1911's design go back to 1897. That year, John Browning patented 4 different designs for semi-automatic handguns. One was a straight blowback pistol that eventually became the FN, model 1900. The other 3 were different takes on a lock breech design, and one used a rotating barrel, kind of like the Beretta PX4 or the Beretta Cougar. One used a toggle action, kind of like the Luger, and one used a barrel that just retracted and dropped to unlock from the slide. So I think you can see where this is going. That was arguably just the simplest approach to the challenge of creating a lock breech system in a handgun, and that is what John Browning and Colt, Browning and Colt kind of partnered to develop this concept. That's what they ended up prioritizing for development, and that led to the Colt's Model 1900. That was the gun they started kind of shopping to the US government for potential adoption as the US military service pistol. One of the US government's biggest gripes about that design was that it was chambered in .38 caliber. And I think we've all heard that story about in the Filipino-American War, the US forces were getting overrun by the crazed Moro rebels, and their .38 caliber revolvers didn't have enough stopping power to stop the charging rebels. They did some testing. John Thompson, the guy who invented the Tommy gun, and this other guy named Louis Lagarde, who I guess was a surgeon in the army, they actually shot a bunch of human corpses with a bunch of different calibers to kind of, test what caliber had the best lethality and could deliver the best stopping power. I know these days we say stopping power is not a thing, but they measured wound cavities, and they actually measured how much the corpses would swing when they shot them with various calibers. So their highly scientific conclusions were that a .45 caliber bullet was better than a .38 caliber bullet. And I guess in 1905 that was good enough for government work because the US government embraced their recommendation, and Browning and Colt kind of refined their design to a .45 caliber pistol. And in that process, instead of using a barrel that just simply retracted and dropped, initially it had two pivoting links, one in breech area and one in the front, so the barrel would kind of stay straight as it dropped, kind of like that. They further simplified that into the tilting barrel that we all know today, and like I said, they changed the caliber of their prototype to .45. They changed the grip angle, made it a little more swept, and by 1910 their series of prototypes kind of evolved into a form that we would recognize today as the 1911. And at that point, they pitted the M1910 prototype against .45 caliber Lugers from Germany, and Savage also had a contender that they submitted to the trials. The Germans eventually pulled their Lugers out of the competition because I guess it just didn't make sense economically or logistically for Germany to supply the US with weapons. Basically, this left the Savage and Colt's 1910 prototype to duke it out, and really there was no contest. I guess the Savage did okay, but it just paled in comparison to the 1910. In one test, the 1910 fired 6,000 consecutive rounds with no breakages, no failures, and they literally dunked it in water to cool it off when it got too hot. Mind you, that is pretty impressive by today's standards, and in 1910, that was unheard of. Semi-automatic pistols just didn't perform like that, and I don't even think revolvers could handle that type of abuse. And it was just a level of reliability and durability that handguns hadn't really seen. The US Army, after that performance, adopted officially the Colt Browning design as the model 1911 because it was 1911. So when you consider the 1911 in context with its contemporaries, it's amazing how elegantly simple the design is. And compared to the Luger and the Mauser C96 and the early Steyr pistols, like the Steyr Hahn and the Roth Steyr, a slide and a barrel that tilts is so much simpler than the complex articulating toggle in a Luger and all the fancy little parts in Lugers, like side plates and whatever else is in there. I mean, they're just very complex designs. Same with the Mauser C96, the stripper clip and the internal bolt and just the machining that went into those guns. Same with the Steyr guns. This thing is just so much simpler, and it obviously kind of defined the format of handguns, from then on. Just about every handgun from then on used a slide, and most semi-automatic handguns use the Browning style tilting barrel. But I think what often doesn't get enough credit for its ingenious simplicity is the 1911's trigger. And there are so few other semi-automatic handguns that use a trigger that slides straight back. And that is huge for what makes the 1911 so damn shootable. I often wonder why more guns don't use a trigger that slides straight back, and I think part of the reason is it's difficult to machine a tunnel through a metal frame like that. So that could be one reason. Most semi-automatic handguns use some sort of top pivoting trigger. Another aspect of the 1911's trigger design that I think is important for why it shoots so well is the fact that the trigger bar on the 1911 uses kind of a dual-sided stirrup design. And so it's imparting pressure from the trigger to the sear more evenly. And when you pull the trigger on a 1911, it's so direct, it's so natural, it's so intuitive. It's almost like you don't even feel the trigger. You feel the sear moving out of the hammer notch. And there's just nothing as natural as the straight back push of a 1911 trigger. There are other ways to make a handgun shootable and make its accuracy accessible, but to this day, I think the best way to make POA equal POI is the 1911's very intuitive, natural, straight push trigger. And that's, I think, part of why the 1911 is still so popular to this day. And while some might consider the Milspec kind of a budget 1911, the trigger on the Milspec, to me, is everything a 1911 trigger should be. It's short, it's crisp, it's responsive, the reset is tactile, the break is crisp and clean, and it's great. Like, I realize more expensive, bougier 1911s have lighter triggers, but man, I mean, what else are you looking for at this price point? I mean, it makes the shootability of the platform 100% accessible. And really, the Milspec in general is everything a 1911, I think, should be. And, when you get this gun in your hands, it just, I know it's kind of a cliche, but it feels like quality. It has this sense of density to it that well-made things typically do. And the grip angle falls somewhere, I think, between like a Beretta 92, which is a little more upright, and a Glock, which is more swept back. So it's somewhere in the middle, and it feels good. I'll say the gun feels taut, but not necessarily tight. There's a little play to the slide, but it feels really well put together. And when you pull this gun out of battery, there's a slight hesitation as the lugs are disengaging, and it makes you realize that someone at Springfield was paying attention to the lockup and the fit, and there's a snugness to the lockup, yet there's not a tightness that gives you this undue sense of friction, like it's too tight. Like if you've ever messed with like a Les Baer in 1911, I mean, those guns are so tight, it's like they're hard to manipulate. Nothing like that with this, and to me, for a reliable combat pistol, a service pistol, you don't necessarily want that. Nothing about this gun feels sloppy or loose like some Colts I've had, and it just feels really good. It feels like a really well-made product. The finish is excellent. This is a phosphate type / parkerized finish, and you can get the Milspec in stainless as well, though that costs a little more. But the finish is really nice. It's really uniform. It's really even. It looks really good. It's basic. It's not fancy. I don't need it to be fancy, but it looks good. It looks classy, and it's not just festooned with a bunch of bullshit cuts and markings and everything like that. And I love the way they mark the slide with this understated, simple one line of text, Milspec. Like it just looks great. It looks classy. It looks sophisticated. They got the Springfield logo here on the other side. It looks good to me. I don't love forward slide serrations on 1911s, and again, I love the kind of simple, minimalistic look. Love the rear slide serrations on this, and I tend to prefer slanted serrations on 1911s and just guns in general. I realize that the straight serrations are kind of the classic, and I get why that's nostalgic to many people, but I don't know. I feel like slanted serrations pick up the grip angle a little more and kind of look a little more complete in terms of the industrial design. So this thing looks great to me. Taking this gun to the range, like, it's just like casual bullseyes, like boom, bullseye, boom, bullseye. And in some sense, it's just like, dude, like, shouldn't this be harder? Unless you just completely fuck up your trigger press and, you know, just are shooting terribly, the gun puts rounds where you want it. It's shooting to point of aim is just so natural and so just like an afterthought, and it's such an intuitive shooter. You know, I can't say there's anything magical about like the feel of the 1911 when it cycles. Guns like the Beretta PX4 with the rotating action, I mean, it feels very plush and very communicative, and like the HK P9S with its roller delayed blowback system, it gives you this zen-like sense of connection with every shot, and it's just super direct. I don't necessarily experience anything like that when I'm shooting a 1911, but that's the beauty of the 1911, is that you don't need that. It just has a really, really great trigger, and you know, I feel like the long, heavy slide gives you kind of a slower, more predictable, softer recoil impulse that's just, even with the heavier round, it just, you know, it's easy to get into a rhythm, and it has the right feedback, and it's never snappy or whippy or uncontrollable. It's just kind of a, you know, a big brawny shove. You let the muzzle do its thing, and you're right back on that super direct trigger break, and you got another bullseye waiting for you. It's just everything it needs to be to shoot well. Again, point of aim equals point of impact. It's just simple math. That's why we love the 1911, and the Springfield Mil-Spec is everything we expect from a 1911 in terms of shootability. It is a great shooting gun. So that brings us to the $1,911 question. Why wouldn't you carry a 1911? If the 1911 is so good and the Milspec is such a good 1911, why doesn't everyone carry one? Why do we even have other handgun designs? And I think part of that question, the answer to that question, lies in size and weight and caliber. But I think also the answer to that question, part of the answer, lies in reliability, or at least perceptions of reliability. And lately, I think the 1911 has in some ways been stigmatized by you know, some people in terms of how they see its reliability compared to more modern designs. And I think we need to look into that a little bit, because it's something that I see come up a lot on forums and discussions about the 1911. The truth is, this is a 19th century design. Its original patent originated in 1897. So I think, you know, when you look at how things are made, you know, this gun was designed for 19th century manufacturing technology, and 19th century manufacturing for mechanical products usually involves some degree of hand tuning, hand fitting. In 21st century manufacturing, that's not as much of a thing. So can a 1911 like this be reliable? And I have my opinion, but first I want to give you some historical context to kind of back up that opinion. If we go back to the days after World War II and look at Colt, and the 50s and 60s for Colt were kind of a golden age for them. They had lots of revenue from, wartime contracts, and the staff, the skilled staff that they had was still there. And the old school gunsmiths that knew how to make, really good 1911s and really good revolvers, they were still doing that. But by the 70s, those people were retiring and they weren't there anymore. They had to hire new people, and quality control began to suffer. Then as we get into the 80s and 90s, as I think most of us know, Colt had a lot of problems with strikes and bankruptcies. Quality control continued to kind of languish through the 80s and 90s, and at some point people were they kind of accepted the fact that it was kind of hit or miss whether you were gonna get a reliable 1911 from Colt, and it just kind of became a foregone conclusion that you buy a 1911 and you're going to have to take it to a gunsmith to kind of sort it out, look it over, make sure it was good to go, and that was just standard operating procedure. I mean, that was before my time. At least that's what I've gleaned from looking at other perspectives about 1911s. And it's also worth noting that really up until like the mid-90s, the 1911 was almost exclusively a Colt product. I mean, you had a few other kind of obscure things like the Tonics and AMT and some other ones and some custom shops, but really if you were getting a 1911, you were getting a Colt. I get the sense that we didn't use the term 1911 like we do today. People just said Colt 45 or that's my 45. In lieu of Colt's failings through the 80s and 90s, competitors started to spring up. Springfield was one, and then we also had Kimber. Were Springfield and Kimber's 1911s any better than what Colt was making around that same time in the 90s? I'm not sure, but I think they were selling them for less, so that created more competition for Colt. They still had the Colt name. To this day, people still revere the Colt name. Other 1911s from other brands, in some ways, just seem like not as authentic as getting a Colt. And that's how I felt for a long time, and that's why I always kind of defaulted to Colt 1911s, but I love this Milspec. In any case, I'm getting off on a tangent. And then you had other 45 platforms from other companies that were completely different. The Smith & Wesson offering the 4506 platform, and they had obviously a number of different sizes within that. These were really good guns. They were double action, single action, which was the preferred platform back in the 80s and 90s. So they had a lot of law enforcement contracts with this. Same with Sig Sauer's P220 series. This is a P245. I have a review on this gun. I also have a review on the 4506-1, but again, double action, single action, a lot of law enforcement contracts with Sig Sauer's 45s. Then you had Glock with the Glock 21, Glock 30. You had, H&K with the USP series. So as a service pistol, it just seemed like the 1911's days were kind of done. I think this perspective developed from Colt's rocky road throughout the 80s and 90s that, 1911s just weren't to be taken seriously as service pistols anymore because their reliability was just kind of questionable. But here's the thing. It's not the 1990s anymore. And companies have had 30 years to figure out how to produce good 1911s using modern mass production methods. CNC machining is better than it's ever been, and companies have processes in place where I think they can kind of mitigate the differences in what it takes to produce a 1911 with modern technology. And I think we see that in the latest crop of 1911s from companies like Springfield. Yeah, they use MIM parts. Springfield does. Yeah, they glue the ejector in place. The parts are CNC machined to exacting tolerances. They don't have someone hand fitting everything as much as they used to. But all that works. They know it works, and they make 1911s that generally run. And I've put over 500 rounds through this. I haven't always cleaned it between range trips. I've never shot it like dry, but it runs everything. I've run Wilson 47D magazines in it. I ran like a random Ruger mag in it, and it has had zero issues, locked back with every round. I even had a friend I work with. I saw him randomly at the local range, and he was a new shooter, and I handed him this, and he shot it, and he loved it, and no reliability issues. So that's not a torture test. I realize that, and that's not really what I do here. But I think guns that have problems are going to show problems within those parameters of usage. And any gun I've had that's had problems, within a couple hundred rounds, it starts to show some kind of issue. This one did not. And, you know, it kind of corroborates what I hear in general about the Springfield Mil-Spec. People say they're reliable, and you can watch like torture tests on YouTube. I can link a few. And, you know, they do not treat these guns kindly. They run well. I think the consensus is that the Milspec is a really good gun, and it runs really well. If you buy this gun and you buy a Glock 21, you know, is there a higher chance that you're going to have a reliability issue with this versus a Glock 21? Maybe a little, but I think the chances that you're going to have issues with a modern 1911 are very low. And one caveat is that what I'm saying really applies to 5-inch classic government length, aka full-size 1911s in 45 ACP. And in this day and age, we all know that 1911 means more than that. And, you know, you have Commander 1911s, Officer 1911s, you have Ultra 1911s, you have 9mm 1911s, you have 1911s and other calibers, you have 2011s. The kind of classic thinking is that the farther you get from John Browning's original 5-inch design in 45 ACP, the less likely you are to have a totally reliable platform. And I realize that's kind of a platitude at this point, and like every 1911 review since the dawn of 1911 reviews kind of says that. The thing is, though, it does kind of corroborate my experience with non-standard 1911s. I've had two Commanders, both Colts, and I've had a Springfield EMP 1911, and that has a, you know, compact 3-inch barrel. One of the Commanders, it would start to have failures to feed like after about 100 rounds, and I tried different springs and everything like that, and it just wasn't reliable after a while. I had a CCO 1911, a Colt Wiley clap, and I only shot that gun once, and it didn't have any issues, but honestly, the thing was, it just felt like a piece of shit, if I'm being honest. Like, it was rattly and didn't feel well put together. This gun is so much better put together than both of those Colts I had. It's really a nice gun. I don't regret that this isn't a Colt at all. I mean, I think this is a great gun, and this is certainly the best 1911 I've owned. That little EMP I had, which was nice, I liked that. It was an accurate, good shooting gun, but when I first got it, it wouldn't feed hollow points. I sent it back to Springfield, and they recontoured the feed ramp, and then it fed hollow points fine, and then I just kind of lost interest in it. But, you know, for me, this is what I want in a 1911. I want a big 45 caliber service pistol, and this delivers an excellent experience. So this brings us to the conclusion, and I think it's good to frame that as a question. Why is the 1911 still so popular after 113 years in the business? I hope after watching this review you don't say nostalgia, because there's nothing nostalgic about the way a 1911 shoots. There's nothing soppy and sentimental about effortless accuracy. There's nothing quaint about a brilliantly intuitive trigger pull that makes it easier to shoot more accurately more often. And again, it's a simple equation. POA equals POI. And that is just as relevant today as it was in 1911, and probably always will be. And there is no simpler expression of that simple truth than the Springfield Mil-Spec 45. Head on over to hipstertactical.com and check out the written review if you want some more depth and more texture about the stuff I talked about today. And I just want to thank you for watching. Really appreciate it. My name is Matt, and I will catch you later.